Our daytime educational programmes continue now on BBC Two as History File takes us back to the start of the Atlantic slave trade.
Welcome.
Who are you?
My name is Amina. I come from a long line of people who've passed on our history from generation to generation for hundreds of years. You've selected the history of black peoples of the Americas as a very large group. What do you want to know?
I want to find out about people like me. I mean, I'm British, and I know that my grandparents came from the Caribbean. And my granddad told me that his ancestors came from somewhere else. So I want to know where they came from and why. What's their history?
Your search starts over here, about 4,000 miles from the Caribbean, in Africa. This is where some of your ancestors came from, hundreds of years ago. Africa is a vast continent. Different groups of people lived here, leading different lives. In some parts of Africa, people led very simple lives, and in others, they built up large empires. What would you like to look at? Great Zimbabwe. This is what's left of one of the great African empires. The Shona people lived around here. There was a lot of gold here, which made it a very rich area. There were trade routes across Africa. People bought and sold ivory, leather, spices, gold, cloth, pottery, precious stones. They also bought people who were sold as slaves. Arabic traders came from the north, Indian traders from the east, and European traders from the west. Your ancestors probably came from the west coast of Africa, since this is where many Caribbean people came from. Many different groups of people lived here.
Gao is one of the finest towns of Africa. It is also one of the biggest. It is full of people buying things. Everything is rich and magnificent.
In Timbuktu, there are many shops selling fine cloth. Here are also many doctors, judges, priests, and other clever men.
The horses are all very big and strong, and move much faster than ours.
Groups of traders come to Timbuktu from every part of the world.
Ghana is very large, with several markets. It has fine houses and solid buildings. In Benin, the kings are extremely powerful and are worshipped by their people.
Benin was a large kingdom. The people of Benin were skilled workers in wood and metal and produced many great works of art.
Can I speak to someone? Who's this?
Olada Equiano, born in 1745. he wrote his life story. Much of our information about this period comes from accounts by white people, so this is an important source.
I come from a place called Ibo. My village is in a small valley. Life is quiet. Most people around here spend all their time farming, except when there's something to celebrate. Then there'll be plenty of music and dancing and poetry. I like that. Everybody has to make a new show up with their dance. It could be about something happy or something sad. It has to be a true story about something that has just happened, so the stories are always new.
West Africa. This is where your ancestors came from. An estimated 11 million people were taken by force to North America, to South America, and to the Caribbean.
Why? Why were they taken?
They were taken to be used as slaves. They were bought mainly by European traders. European traders had been trading with Africa for hundreds of years. In 1492, things changed. For the first time, the Europeans found out that there were other lands they hadn't known about, that they could reach by sailing west to the continent we call America. When the Europeans went to America, they saw they could grow things that people would pay high prices for, such as cotton, tobacco, and sugar. If only they could find enough labor to work the land. This is why they enslaved people from Africa.
Why did they use African people? Why not European people?
They did. There just weren't enough European settlers. Nor were there enough of the people who already lived in the islands. In Jamaica, for example, when Columbus first came, there were 60,000 Arawaks living there. 150 years later, they had been almost wiped out.
Can I see somebody?
Yes. I can reconstruct one of the original people for you.
My people are almost all dead. We welcomed these people, and in return they made slaves of us. We get nothing. Not even enough food. My father died of starvation. My brother fell sick with a strange disease they brought with them. Some of my family died fighting them, but they have guns, and we have none. If we refuse to work, they punish us. They've taken everything we have, even our lives.
The African people brought over as slaves were not as badly affected by these diseases. So from the Europeans' point of view, it was a good idea to bring more and more African people across.
So, was this the beginning of slavery?
No. Slavery already existed in many places all over the world before this, not just in Africa. But the Europeans now encouraged the trade in Africa to grow. This gave them the labor they needed. The first people had been taken to the Americas as slaves at the beginning of the 16th century. Once the land was cleared and farms established, there was a great demand for slave labor. The so-called triangular trade grew up. Europeans sailed first to West Africa to trade goods for slaves. The slaves were shipped to America on the second part of the triangle. On the plantations, they grew the fashionable products, which were brought back to Europe to be sold at a good profit. Sugar was used to sweeten drinks and food. Tobacco smoking also became very popular.
In 1750, 10,000 tons of sugar came from Jamaica. By 1800, it was 2 million tons. This sugar was grown by the slave labor of African people and their descendants.
So how did people become slaves?
Anyone who could be captured became a slave. Sometimes there were prisoners of war, but usually there were just ordinary people who were kidnapped. Europeans didn't usually capture the people they took as slaves. They paid African people to do it for them. Being a slave trader became a profitable business.
Everyone had gone off to work in the fields. My sister and me, we were playing. 2 men and a woman grabbed us and took us off into the forest. I cried and I refused to eat for days, but they forced food into my mouth. I was taken through so many lands of Africa. And about 6 or 7 months after I had been kidnapped, we arrived at the seacoast. I found out afterwards that everyone who was captured ended up here, but sometimes they'd walk for hundreds of miles to get here. From wherever they were captured, they would be forced to walk.
I don't understand. Why did African people do this to other African people?
We're only talking about a few people. There were powerful kingdoms in Africa, and some of these rulers were prepared to sell their neighbors in return for the riches they gained.
Especially guns and gunpowder. This arms trade encouraged African people to fight each other.
At the coast, we were kept there for a long time, in prisons they called barracoons. There were so many people there, all speaking their own languages. I felt lonely. I missed my family. I wanted to go home. Men, women, boys, girls, all slept in the same place. It wasn't right. They kept us like this for a long time. Then one day, men came and we were taken out. They looked us over and some of us were made to go with them onto a very big ship.
What happened then?
I was put down under the decks. The air stank. I wanted to die. There were so many people crammed into the hole that no one could move. The chains on my wrists and ankles rubbed my skin to the bone. It was very dirty, and many people died.
This was the Middle Passage. It took between 6 and 12 weeks.
Inside the hold of the ship, they were kept in filthy conditions. It was a perfect breeding ground for disease.
How could they stand it?
Some of them couldn't, but others found ways to survive and even to resist what was happening to them.
Helen! Helen! The shackles are free!
We're always on guard. If we give them the slightest chance, they'll try to take over the ship.
We had to keep them in chains till we saw the land in the Caribbean. Otherwise, they would have killed us.
Whenever they get a chance, they will fight hard and will not give in.
They are desperate and will do anything for freedom.
Did anyone get away?
It was very unlikely. The odds were too high.
Only a small percentage were taken to North America. Most were taken to South America or to the islands in the Caribbean.
In the Caribbean, the first stop was usually Barbados, because that was the first island the ships reached.
After many weeks, we came near to the island of Barbados. The whites on board seemed very happy, and as the seashore got closer, we saw the harbour and lots of other ships.
How did you feel?
Very scared. I didn't know what was going to happen to me. A lot of strange men came on board, and they looked at us. They even made us jump, and they pointed to the land like they were telling us to go there. I thought I might be eaten by these ugly men. After that, we were all put down onto the deck again. I was still very scared.
What happened then?
We were sold. After a few days, we were taken off the ship and we were all pushed into a space, and white men looked at us from the edge of the circle. They waited until they heard a drum beat, and then they rushed into the yard where we were and chose who they wanted. It was very frightening to be pulled about and shouted at.
Sometimes you saw mothers being sold separately from their children and wives being sold separately from their husbands. They weren't likely to see each other again.
That's really awful.
Yes, it is. When people were sold, they also lost their names. No one bothered to use people's own African names.
Equiano was renamed Gustavus Vassa by the man who bought him, and he was known by that name for many years. But when he wrote his autobiography, he deliberately chose to use his African name, Olaudah Equiano.
Most people were given a European name that suited their new masters. That must have added to the sadness and anger that people felt.
So this could have been one of my ancestors, ending up in a strange land. No family, no friends, not even your own name.
It is true that they came without any physical possessions. No money, no shoes, no weapons, no books. But they did bring their memories of their own cultures with them.
What do you mean?
People hung on to their own ways of doing things, their African languages, their stories, their religions, their music, and their skills.
They didn't arrive empty-handed. African culture arrived in the Americas at the same time as the slave ships.
If you'd like to find out more about the resource pack for this series, then call BBC Edu...
On BBC Two with